This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review, a program dedicated to books and ideas and everything in between. This episode is brought to you by Yeshiva University's Center for Israel Studies and the Rabbi Arthur Schneier Program for International Affairs. I'm your host Gilad Halpern, and my guests today are contributors to a new collection of essays entitled Jewish Religious Architecture, From Biblical Israel to Modern Judaism, that has just been published by Brill. Professor Stephen Fine, the director of the Center for Israel Studies, is the editor of the collection and the author of an essay that is included in it entitled Synagogues in the Greco-Roman World. Professor Ronnie Perelis is the author of Jewish Sacred Architecture in the Spanish and Portuguese Diaspora. And Professor Jess Olson is the author of Reimagining the Synagogue in the 19th and 20th Centuries. It is my pleasure to welcome all of you to the show.
Thank you. Thank you.
Professor Stephen Fine, we'll start with you as the editor. So when I first learned about a book that's about Jewish architecture, I was immediately reminded of that scene from Airplane, the 1970s satirical movie, when one of the passengers asks the flight attendant for some light reading and she hands him a leaflet entitled Famous Jewish Athletes, right? So, because as you write in the introduction, Judaism is famous for being almost entirely preoccupied with texts and not so much with aesthetics. So what light does this specific exploration of visual aesthetics shed on our understanding of Judaism?
First of all, Jews are like everybody else. Sometimes they read and sometimes they see and sometimes they walk into space. And the spaces they create reflect what's essential about their various cultures from antiquity all the way till the present. And so if you're in the world of the Talmud, which is where I live, it's a very different space that you'd walk around. The streets were different, the buildings were different, the clothes were different, the foods were different, and people smelled different than you would if you were in the medieval or the modern or in North Africa as opposed to Germany. And so by looking at the environment and understanding it really in depth, we can also understand much more about the people. And when we understand more about those people, we also understand more about their text. And so it's a circular process of using the text to understand the human beings involved and using the spaces to understand those texts. It's for a holistic view of Jews. And this book is about various places everywhere from India to the temple in Jerusalem to Los Angeles, and how Jews in all of those places have walked through space and created it, and what that said distinct about those Jewish communities, or not distinct about them, what made them like their neighbors in almost every way, except for the one that made them different.
Is all this relatively mundane stuff, I would say, it's not sacred or not entirely sacred, present in the sources that you have, readily available?
Well, we have so many different kinds of sources, right? From the Talmud to Josephus to city records in German cities to newspapers, and it's everywhere. It's often about how to mine it and how to read it and developing the eyes to see, rather than about the material existing or not.
Can you develop that in your specific field of interest in antiquity? What kind of mechanisms were needed to mine that, as you say?
Well, let me give you an example. Talmudic literature does not write explicit essays most of the time. It doesn't always say, this is what we're thinking. Instead, it's a form of case law. It gives you examples of how things work, and then through an internal hermeneutic, an internal way of explaining, tells you why this matters and how it functions in any particular environment. That means that if I want to understand how a synagogue worked in the world of in the 2nd century, I have a lot of sources, but this source could talk about directionality in prayer. And that source could talk about synagogues being on top of mountains. And the other source could talk about not eating in synagogues. And you have to then constructively put it together in order to create a picture. They're not interested in the material I work with in telling me that information or answering my question. I have to ask them in their language what they want to tell me.
The interesting thing about architecture is that it's unique in the sense that it has both a functional and an aesthetic quality to it. Can you elaborate each in your own field how that came about?
Yeah, the people that I focus on in my book are a community that on some level is Yesh Miayin. Their symbol is the phoenix that arises from the ashes. These were people who left Spain in 1492, went over the border to Portugal. Within 5 years, for political expedient reasons, the king forcibly converted all of them. So poof, they become Catholics. And within a few generations, they are all streaming out of Portugal looking for places to live. A small minority of them decide to stay Jewish, and they re-embrace Judaism openly in places of tolerance like Amsterdam. So they show up to a place which is the only place in Western Europe where Jews can be openly Jewish at the time. And it's Amsterdam. It's a bustling cosmopolitan place and these people now have the means, because they were wealthy merchants, at least the elite of the community, and they were in a place that allowed them to create a sacred space of their own. So from beginning to end, it is a theoretical project, that is inspired by specific ideas about what sacred space should look like. They have the ability to put it in a central part of town. It's not hidden behind a wall. It's not down some alleyway. It is in a nice part of town, open to all. It becomes a tourist attraction. Non-Jews coming through Amsterdam make it a point to go visit the synagogue. And the sources that inspire their vision of what this should be are new re-engagements with ancient history, with biblical history. In particular, there's the question of reimagining the biblical Temple of Solomon as an ideal for the Mikdash Me'at, the small microcosm sanctuary of their exilic place. And so one of the main sources for their ideas is a rabbi who was known as Leon Templo. Templo was his nickname that he developed because he became the temple guy. And he wrote a book about Solomon's temple with great drawings based on earlier Jesuit research into it, but infusing with his own rabbinic knowledge into what the temple might have looked like. And so he takes this theoretical biblical thing into the actual construction of the great Portuguese synagogue of Amsterdam. And it has the same sloping buttresses that you would have seen in depictions of Solomon's temples. The types of columns it has evokes the Yachinu Boaz of the temple. So this is a place, and this is a community that purposefully creates a sacred space based on sources, and that they very much want to create a public venue for their spiritual life. And it's also a calling card. It's saying, we're here, we're part of society, and this is who we are.
Jess Olson?
It's great. I feel bad for putting you on the spot to go first, but it's good that you did, because I just, in response to kind of what you were saying, which dovetails very nicely, I was fascinated that you just pointed out that the Portuguese synagogue became a statement of what I would call kind of a statement of arrival, of place, of belonging, in a sense. Well, my period, which is mostly I'm dealing with the 1840 to 1929 period, mostly in European and North American synagogue construction, I would have said, well, that's exactly what happened in my period. In fact, that's what distinguishes my period. Now, I have to take that back, because I think that shares in common with what Ronnie was talking about. But interestingly, there's an important transformation that I could also sort of play off of what Ronnie was saying, which is that whereas Ronnie's subjects are kind of still coming, primarily deriving their inspiration from an internal dynamic, right? They're looking inside themselves for the sources to understand. My subjects, for one of the, I'm not really like to say first times, but what characterizes their work is the assumption of an external aesthetic, an aesthetic that is picked for them, then is embraced and taken for their own to become the statement of what Judaism looks like in a liberalizing emancipation dynamic, right? So what do I mean by this? the typical style of buildings during the aesthetic of your classic, let's say, Central European and even North American 19th century synagogue is a historicist construction, right? Utilizing elements from the imagination of the romantic German architect Gottfried Semper, who, when he was commissioned, non-Jew, was commissioned to design the new Dresden synagogue in 1840, went back to his draft books of sketches he'd collected in Sicily of Moorish architecture. No explicit connection to Jewish history, no explicit connection to Jewish identity. Yet in Semper's mind, this was the Orient, right? This represented what he envisioned, and to him, it was a certain nobility, right? A certain beauty. And that was what he sought to evoke in this building. This building, this Dresden synagogue, then became, in a sense, a template for a franchise of neo-Moorish synagogues, which you can still see several examples within 5 miles of where we're sitting today, including across the street. It's a very late example, 1929. And so fascinatingly, what I would say typifies the relationship between aesthetic and function, in my case, is this interesting intersection of external understanding of what it means to be a Jew in the 19th century, internal embrace of the positive ideas of that view, all being played against a backdrop of a very tenuous socio-political situation. So that's how I would kind of see it.
Going back 2,000 years to the Greco-Roman world, Stephen Fine.
All of this starts with small communities throughout the land of Israel and the diaspora deciding that they needed larger buildings to think about themselves. But our book does something even more odd. It starts with a building that we only know from writing, it's really just a tent, the tabernacle in the desert. And then it goes to the Temple of Solomon that doesn't exist anymore. And then the Temple of Herod that doesn't exist anymore. And then it goes through the entire diaspora and all of its communities until we start talking about the Sukkah as religious architecture. And after the Sukkah as religious architecture, we do the Eruv as religious architecture. And so our book is about the non-existent to the almost unseeable, right? And it makes a statement of continuity across Jewish history that isn't always made, especially in North America today. We get so focused on our details and our specific periods that sometimes we can't see the grand expanse of connectedness, or alternately, we choose not to see the grand expanse of connectedness. Looking at the various trees, what we were able to do with people from every single field of Jewish studies was ask historians and architectural people and art historians to come back and think about this question of what connects and what separates, to create a kind of narrative through the agency of this one small institution.
And really, it also raises questions, especially in the earlier chapters, in the earlier periods, about the understanding of congregation and community and the development of this, very concept of a place of worship. What can you say about that in your specific cases?
To answer that, and also to riff off of what Steve just said, one of the beauties of this book is that Steve conceived of it as a truly multi- and cross-disciplinary project. And I can speak for myself, and I think this was Jess' experience to some extent also. I never wrote about architecture before. I never wrote about images before. I'm a literature person and a text person, but it's the living experience of the people who use these buildings that was important. What did this building mean to them? How did it function? How did the aesthetics connect to their religious ideas, to their sociopolitical realities? And so I was stretched in writing this, and it's changed me forever. It changed my teaching. It's changed the way I look at buildings that I walk around to, and in all these ways. And so the centrality of the fact that these are real people who built these buildings and used these buildings and thought about these buildings and loved them and hated them and everything that goes along with that
the conception of a place of worship and community and how it reflects.
So, of course, this is really interesting because in my period in particular, it's very fresh, right? It's fresher, right? And that concept of community, fascinatingly enough, I mean, this is something I knew from my work as a Central Europeanist, right? That it so happens that the synagogue and literally the building itself, the structure itself, became the flashpoint of communal strife and conflict, right? That literally the buildings which I am devoting time to sort of understanding and detailing and understanding the ornament and understanding what they're after and who designed it, right, are literally causing, or not causing, but are the representations both of a sort of reimagining of what the community should look like, right? I mean, that's what most of these synagogues are. Most of these synagogues are built really in a period of massive expansion of synagogue building in Europe. I mean, these buildings, it's hard to wrap one's mind around the fact that one could scarcely go to a town of more than several thousand people from the Rhine River to the Oder and not find one of these synagogues, right, dominating a public square. And I mean, I've seen this myself for those that still survive. I mean, very few. But you go to a place like Pilsen and you see, these massive building dominating the entire city. I mean, it's incredible.
You can understand why the Nazis would destroy them then.
The symbolic power of that speaks volumes, right? So it's fascinating at the same time, right? So much of this architecture was shaped both in reaction and response and sometimes stridency of a rejection, maybe a rejection of the impulse behind building a modern building, right, in sort of an orthodox reaction to these structures. And then the final sort of permutation of this we see around the turn of the 20th century, we actually see Orthodox communities, I think without even really, it's not unconscious, but without really kind of thinking about what they're doing, adapting the most avant-garde designs of the time, where you literally see using like arts and crafts style in the most conservative synagogue, the synagogue of the IRG, the Israelitische Religionsgemeinde in Frankfurt. That's Rav Hirsch's community using, right, arts and crafts and Art Deco style to make a very strident, kind of reactionary position. So, to me, that question is just such a central, concern to the buildings I was looking at.
And also, as has been mentioned here a few times already, that it is kind of a statement about the status in that specific historical time, that it has always to do with upheaval. I mean, this is Jewish history after all, right? History is what happens when Jews are busy making other plans. But what can you say about really the way that synagogues help them assert the new status in the new place?
One thing I think about right away, one image that I invoke in my article is a map of Curacao, the small desert island off the coast of Venezuela that is still a Dutch colony and was a haven for Jews for hundreds of years. And on this postcard, it has like a little map of Willemstad. There's little numbers. And then if you look at the key, number 19 is the synagogue. And the synagogue, again, it's not somewhere far away, tucked away, hidden, secret. The synagogue is in the main street. And if you go, if you get off a cruise boat, whatever, in there, you see the synagogue. It is right there. The Jews are not scared. The Jews are a central part of the society. It's close to where their businesses are. They're there. They exist, right? And that is such a American or modern story.
But if you went to the city of Sardis in Asia Minor, which is just inland from Izmir, 1,500 years ago, there's a synagogue made with the most beautiful marble at the center of the city, next to the gymnasium, next to the city hall, about the size of a football field in size. Huge, amazing, no smaller than almost any of the other synagogues we've discussed, that these Jews in a diaspora community created, used, donors who weren't Jewish, lots of them, people who, there's a guy named Socrates who's a God-fearer who gave a menorah, This is an amazing prehistory. And the most interesting piece for me in the whole synagogue is an aluminum plaque with all of the American rabbis and rich people who gave money to create this reconstruction and excavation by Harvard University which included both donors to YU and donors to the Hebrew Union College and everything in between. What does that say about our modern world? What does that say about the ancient world? And most of all, for me, with the three of us sitting here and the 20-some authors that we are in this book, who are all so different, but yet we're looking at a phenomenon that by putting it together, we can see and have a conversation that we might not be able to have on a normal day.
Well, I just want to sort of just go off of what Steve just said. It's really, I have to say, I'm kind of, my mind is being opened, right? Fascinating, the degree to which elements of patterns of relationships are repeated over, eons, right, of the work that we're talking about, right? I could very much say some of the same things, right, about what is happening. And of course, Steve and I have talked about this, right? I mean, one of the same thing, some of the same impulses, the same. It makes me wonder, about our own standards as historians of periodization and their own kind of hackneyed quality, right? That we, as a modernist, I'm prepared to say, well, this was the first time that Jews were engaged with their neighbors in such a way as to adapt theirs, which is, of course, nonsense. I mean, I know, as I've looked at, columns on synagogues in Israel, I mean, so really what I love about this book and what I love about the approach of looking at this kind of material, this kind of data, is just, it really explodes so many of the categories that we hold, I think incorrectly, very dearly as historians, which is what kind of makes the project so exciting, or makes it exciting that there is a deeper sort of substructure of meaning in these buildings that, is independent of their specific location historically, but really connects all of them. That's.
What about the sort of like aesthetic dialogue that they had with other religions, or even cross-pollination, if I may, and how synagogue construction influenced and was influenced by construction of other places of worship?
The aesthetic question with Jews is always tough because Europe decided at some point that Jews are the nation without art, and the Jews are the nation without architecture, and that Jewish men menstruate, and we don't exercise. And there were all these constructions of what a Jew is in Europe, and almost the last one to fall is the Jews don't do things that you can touch and see. That still exist in the big world, and people talk about it as if it's real, but if you walk through our book or walk through the Israel Museum or any of the good collections, it becomes really obvious that while Jews were generally not Medicis, they also weren't as wealthy as Medicis. And within their economic spaces, they were doing amazing and interesting things that say something unique about them, but also something about the larger culture in which they lived, whether it be my Roman period synagogues or whether it be the most current buildings being built on the campus of Tel Aviv University, right? We're dealing with a phenomenon that's been underappreciated within the writing of Jewish history. So historians will tell you about all these intellectual trends and social trends, but how many of them besides Cecil Roth will tell you how this stuff is really essential to understanding the social and religious history of the Jews, including people who wrote books on the social and religious history of the Jews?
Also, one of the things I have two students in my earlier class today that are here, and one of the things we were talking about, we were dealing with medieval Spain and the construction of synagogues there, and the strange point-counterpoint that happened there where Jews living under Christian kings would adopt Islamic styles in their synagogues to at once show their rootedness in Spain and at the same time show that they're not Christian.
Right.
But that they are in line with the aesthetic tastes of the elites. And so this point-counterpoint, and something else that's so interesting, we begin, almost every class of any medieval Jewish history class or classical Jewish history class will begin talking about the status of the Jews and all the laws restricting Jewish life. And like one of the main things is the synagogue has to be low. The synagogue can't be constructed. It can't be rebuilt. And it's so great to actually see synagogues that flaunt all those rules. Was it a fluke? Was it a tiny window? Fine. But look at this. These are people of different levels of means creating their space. It's not just what people tell them they can do or what they think they're doing, but actually Jews crafting the space they live in and doing it intentionally and doing it with real kind of using it as a way to speak about something much larger. It's subtle, and it gets us thinking about our own. Today we began talking, I asked them about their synagogues, where they go, to pray on, regularly. What do they look like? What do they make them think? Just to realize that buildings are speaking. They're also a text, I guess. I mean, maybe that's my textual.
Maybe the texts are actually buildings.
The texts are buildings.
It can go both ways.
Well, build again, going off Ronnie. I'm fascinated how close our things are.
Yeah, we talk about Germany.
It's funny because it's often the kind of default of thinking about the buildings I was writing about, that they're. I've had the experience of asking my students, when you see these changes that were being introduced in, say, the 1820s in Hamburg and other places, why was this happening? And a lot of my students will say, well, they're copying churches. Well, now there's something to that, but it's exactly kind of what Ronnie was saying. It's this interesting dialogue, right? The Jewish structures are definitely following in the trends of the general building tendencies of the time, both secular and sacred architecture. Historicism in the 19th century is the absolute dominant model, by which I mean, just to define the term, right, meaning utilizing historical elements of architecture in order to make a present intellectual, political point about your group, right, that you utilize, right? So using this so-called neo-Moorish, right, is supposed to be evocative of something. It's not authentic, but it's evocative, right? So Jews fall into a habit, I would say, of using a particular style that then kind of catches on. It sort of gets divorced from its original meaning, if it actually had an authentic original meaning, and becomes the style that you build it in, because those are the style that you're expected to build it in. Other groups that you're surrounded by are building in their style, you build in your style. It's a statement of arrival, it's a statement of belonging, of presence. So all those things are kind of active in the buildings that I'm talking about as well.
But it was also the process at the end of the 19th century of creating Jewish culture, whether it be the cultural Zionist or the diaspora nationalist, but it was mostly the cultural Zionist who said, Jews are people, they have flesh and blood. And it was especially those who lived in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, where Jews were the nation that didn't have a piece of land within the empire, but was still considered a nation, that Jews started looking, okay, what makes us a nation? What's our stuff? Well, that eventually, of course, leads to Theodor Herzl and the creation of institutions like the Israel Museum and corpora like the Index of Jewish Art to pull this material together to make that statement of Jewish roundness, Jewish humanity. And our book is from historian to historian about that, but none of us were writing to that, except me, because I was the editor. None of us were writing to that. We were writing to our own periods. And it just so happened that the large round effect happened.
I want to just sort of piggyback on that. Not just the Zionists. What I found fascinating, it sort of goes across many different groupings. What I found most interesting, the expression of what you're describing, of utilizing the vocabulary, let's say, of the surrounding world to express an extremely internal dynamic. Is the great example of this is in Hasidic architecture, interestingly enough. What is that, right? Well, if you go to Sadagora, which is currently in the Bukovina in Ukraine, the Sadagora Rebbe's Hof, his castle, is a castle. It's got crenellations. It's a Renaissance Baroque castle, right? Why? Because he's the Melech, right? He's the Melech, right? And so here you have the use of medieval, an imagining of medieval architecture through a Renaissance frame to crown the Melech of Hasidim in Ukraine. It's absolutely amazing.
In Tel Aviv, what's the Sedagora setup? Because I know they're in Tel Aviv. Do you know if is their building just like a Tel Avivi Bauhaus building, or okay, this is something for research.
The Belz Beit Medrash, this massive Beis Medrash in Yerushalayim, is actually using. It's a riff, right? It's a sort of update, if you will, of the Beis Medrash in Poland. Like, I mean, they're consciously evoking, well, it's not so different from Brooklyn, right? Except it's using Queens. I don't know why I said Queens.
Yeah, but they didn't build
Because
it.
the Ohel's in
That was a
Queens.
hospital.
Right. No, but that's what I'm saying. But then it becomes, you know, the
Standard.
Yeah.
The standard, or even if you were to drive, as my family does often, to Kiryas Yoel, which is a Satmar community, you would think you were in a yeshuv in the West Bank. The way it's constructed, the way the buildings look, the way the Beit Midrash looks. They built a Jewish town. They didn't notice that it was the Jewish town that they were revolting against. And that they're not really revolting against. That's the interesting thing. In other words, there's the public statements and then there's the real life statements. And this is some of what we can take out of the architecture. Often people write things, especially in halachic literature, you write about the things you don't like. Right? You go through responsa literature. This happened and we didn't like it. This has been there for 500 years and now we hate it. Right?
Letters to the editor.
Yes, but on serious subjects, but Sheilot and Shuvot, responsa literature, is not about, oh, this is normal and nice, right? It's always about something that's bothering somebody. And so our literature is skewed. What this corpus does is let us say, oh, what's the normal, uneventful, and just human of these lives when they weren't struggling with, well, should we have that tree painted on the wall of the synagogue in Germany, or shouldn't we? Well, guess what? They had trees painted on the walls of synagogues in Germany, and so did Christian guild halls, and so did churches. And that's the humanity of the project that helps us better understand those literary sources and how they nuance it.
Yeah, I want to just add one other thing about the lived experience of these buildings. I think, for me personally, especially the topic I chose, it's not just something historical. It's not an artifact, right? The Great Synagogue in Amsterdam is not just an artifact, but it was the model for a living community that exists throughout the world. Today, it's much more reduced and changed, but when I was doing my graduate work, I lived in Philadelphia, and my regular synagogue became Mikveh Israel, which was founded in 1740 by Spanish and Portuguese Jews. They followed the minhag to a T, and I never seen anything like it until I went there, and it became my spiritual home for 5 years. And so when I wrote that essay, I end with Mikveh Israel, which is, it was originally designed by Louis Kahn, and then they hired another architect to finish it, but it's extremely modernist, and yet still maintained the essence of the same synagogue patterns going back to Amsterdam. And that back and forth is because it was lived. It was a lived place. It's a place where people would come regularly, place where they would celebrate, mark these exhibits. And I just want to just kind of shout out to our students again, teaching our students who understand that these buildings are living places that are inhabited by all sorts of people in all sorts of stages in their life, I think definitely informed the way I thought, at least about writing this book, and it's changed the way I think about buildings. So it's
Okay, yeah. We now have time for questions. If you have one, please come to the mic.
I wanted to ask Dr. Fine, the professor spoke about, with regards to 16th century architecture and 19th century architecture, this idea of the Jewish communities importing foreign architectures in order to create a national consciousness. What is it about late antiquity that sort of the Jews there are using styles of architecture which their neighbors are using almost identically? So what is it about that is there some lack of national consciousness there?
Look, that's a great question. People use the architecture of the world in which they lived, right? And so if you go to the great synagogue at Dura-Europos with its wonderful wall paintings, you see Moses in his toga, and that's what people wore when they went down the street. And they had beards that looked like Roman beards, and they looked like Hadrian because that was his beard that everyone adopted. People do what everyone around them does unselfconsciously until you get to the modern period where they're trying to figure out what a Jewish form of architecture looks like. So in Philadelphia, the most sophisticated Jewish city of the 19th century, they copied ancient synagogues in Israel and built a small synagogue there. In New York, not surprisingly, Temple Emmanuel, which is the grandmother of Reformed Judaism in America, took its cue from Gothic architecture in building a big building, but the Jewish Theological Seminary, which was far less revolutionary and intentionally conservative, not surprisingly, created a building that was Americanist, that was neo-colonial. And uptown at Yeshiva, they did what you would expect a sort of hybrid, wonderful Art Deco building that goes everything from medieval Spain to the contemporary to express their notion of that merged and complex culture that American Orthodoxy was trying to form in the 1920s and is continuing to form. In other words, the architects in the ancient world built buildings like the same building down the street, except in a Christian building, you are likely to have a baptismal pool, and a synagogue, you are going to have an ark. But let me give you an example in Rome, okay? Everybody has cabinets for their books, and every kind of pagan has an altar that looks like a cabinet in his house, right? With these little family gods on it. Great. You won't be surprised that in Italy, they kept the doors open and showed you the scrolls inside and all of the representations of the Torah Ark. But in Israel, they didn't. The Ark is always closed. My guess being that in Italy, not everybody's sure what's inside that Jewish box, but in Palestine, everybody knows that the Jews keep scrolls in there. It's all local. It's all has to do with relationship, which is what's wonderful about writing and thinking and living Jewish history, that sense that there's the ever-changing uniqueness of this material within a larger context. Anyway, that's my take.
More questions?
Hey, just following up on what Professor Fine was saying, I was wondering to what extent this modeling the architecture of the communities that they come from, to what extent it's conscious, to what extent it is subconscious, and how that changed over time from antiquity to modern day.
From what I know, at least the people I studied, it was conscious, but at some point it becomes. One of the things I talk about is the network, right? These are communities that move out, right? So there's Amsterdam as a metropole, and then they have satellite communities, and all the satellite communities follow the same pattern, but will use local colors. Literally, in Curacao, it's these bright tropical colors, but the same structure, right? And it's a conscious effort to mimic and echo that. Everything that goes with what that means, and the spiritual ideas of mikdash me'at, and also familiarity, so that I'm a merchant, I go from Amsterdam to London, I know what to expect. And then I go to New Amsterdam, I know what to expect. And then I go to Curacao in Jamaica, I know what to expect. And when I come back, it's this kind of, I'm in this world. So there is a lot of consciousness, but at the same time, the materials will be, in the Caribbean, they have sand on the floor, and tour guides will give you all these beautiful midrashim about what the sand means. It's because if you don't put sand on the wood floor in the Caribbean with the heat and the salt air, it will destroy. So is that a conscious? Is that, again, there's the reality of what's around them. We don't know in the Spanish context, what I was talking about before, the use of Islamic styles. We don't know exactly why they chose that. We understand from the wider context who else is using those styles, and we can see them making choices about yes, this, and not that. But it's not always so obvious and not always so linear. But
yeah, I think this is a crucial question, this question of conscious versus unconscious motivation. And I think about it this way. More often than not, at least in the modern period, I feel where the consciousness comes in is in trying to justify the overt exception or the overt embrace of the aesthetic of the surrounding society for reasons that have to do with the present conditions, right? 19th century German Jews are building the buildings they're building because they're making a statement about their place in German society, which is we should be accepted as the civilized people and the proper Germans that we are. Our architecture represents the formality and beauty of your greatest architecture, just like our ideas represent what you are. We are fighting a struggle for legal rights. This is a matter, we have to project a certain image. And then becomes a question, well, how do you fit this in? Like, how does this reflect? And then traditionalists who have a different take on those questions, who don't necessarily regard their political emancipation, some avenue to acceptance in the broader society as a particular concern or even an interest, right, will rail against the halakhic issues, right? So then what do you have to justify the Jewish content of so in other words, the Jewish content becomes the conscious element, not that, so the unconscious element is not, what am I trying to say here? That they have to actually convert the way that they think about their buildings to fit a Jewish preconception in order to legitimate it. It's fascinating dynamic. I'm just thinking about the idea of Mizrach, right? Of course, a shul has to face east, right? And, it's ridiculous.
As long as the street's in the right place.
Right,
yes.
that's right. I mean, in theory, right? But it's how often is this principle honored in the breach more than the observance? I mean, to me, that's kind of the fascinating dynamic, that what's often happening is this sort of, interaction between, current situation and how do you square that with an idea of Judaism?
But in antiquity, there wasn't this kind of reflective thinking about how we reconstruct ourselves after being exiled from Spain, or how do we make ourselves into good Americans. It was about, we have this institution, and you can watch the buildings from century to century, from the 4th century to the 5th century to the 6th century to the 7th century, getting more complex, getting more ornate. The synagogue going from being a place where you meet together to do their religion stuff to a holy place in its own right, with an ark and a parochet and all this temple stuff, right? Which didn't exist. In my dissertation, I was able to almost trace this transformation in real time from the 1st century to the 5th or 6th. It's really different than later periods where they are consciously trying to figure out what to do in a new situation. Mine is slower, just as in Islamic countries, I think it was slower, except since they couldn't build their synagogues high, they would build them low. And in medieval Ashkenaz, they would build, well, what are they going to build? A Gothic synagogue in a Gothic country, except when they put the rib vault on, they add just another rib so it doesn't look like a cross, right? In other words, they're going to find ways to live within that environment. And when I walk in, I say, oh, good, look at that extra rib. Isn't that cool? Or it's that synagogue. Why did I just have to step down into it? What accommodations that I may or may not know from literary sources are these people making in order to survive, in order to thrive? How are they building the mikvaot? How are they burying? These are all the physical questions that help us to deal with these traditional cultures before we hit the modern world where everything starts to fragment and get built as a statement. I don't think my buildings are statements, except maybe in a place like Sardis, right? I think they are, we've made it, they've made it, the Mithrites have a building, the Christians have a building, and we have a building. And this is what you do in our world, with the emphasis on the word our.
It's the thing that I think about, and is how different, to a great extent, our contemporary American suburban synagogues are. How they often just look like big houses. They're like so at home and bourgeois and like not conscious. And you have to go inside, and then maybe there's touches, maybe there's Jerusalem stone to evoke that, or the furniture's looks just like an Israeli synagogue. So there's these kind of modern Israeli connections. But it's interesting how maybe when we feel so comfortable today, we don't think we need to make a statement.
Or we're making a statement
by not making.
Comfort.
Yes, yeah, exactly, yeah.
Another generation will look at us and say, "Oh, look, they were so comfortable in America." And what does this say about the relationship to the Holy Land and to their ancestors? And they'll go on about us the way we go on about them.
And as a member of a synagogue that is currently undergoing a renovation, I can tell you the amount of consideration that goes into those matters is zero right now. Right. It's zero. It is, what can we afford? What contractors can we get? Can we get something that looks like Jerusalem stone, but we don't? And I don't mean that I think that's very important. I don't mean that as dismissive at all. I think it's really important. And I think that's one thing. If there's one thing that I wish I could have done more of in this book, or in this article, it would have been to understand more of those tachlis issues, right? More of those issues of, what, and there's what to look at, right? What is the board looking at when they decide to do this remodel, right? Who's the guy like me who says, why can't we just put down fresh carpeting and paint and call it good, right? And who's the guy who wants to do this massive remodel? Like, it's hard to answer those questions, but in a way, I wonder, aren't those questions maybe more important than constructing some fantasy of what people were imagining they were doing when they were building these buildings? Because I wonder if those are more the consideration.
More questions?
I was just wondering, to what extent would you say the establishment of the State of Israel has had an effect on synagogue architecture, both in Israel and in the diaspora?
Walk across the street from where we are right now, and you will see a new building built at Yeshiva maybe a decade ago. If you walk in, look at it, it's a kind of modernism with light wood furniture and a patchwork parochet, curtain in front of the Torah ark, that could exist in Gush Etzion in 10 seconds, right? Or in any other Israeli yeshiva, right? When you compare that to our historic building, which looked like all of the synagogues and Jewish institutions being built in Palestine, especially, and in Europe, and in San Francisco, and everywhere else at that moment, we're looking at two different worlds. And if you continue in that old building, you'll see by the door that there's a great big mezuzah. But guess what? Next to it, there's a scratch on the metal for a short little mezuzah, which is the one they put up in 1929, as opposed to the one that they put up today, right? If you look at the floor, there's a zodiac because they were studying ancient synagogues, right? And they were connecting themselves. Here they're connecting to the yeshiva experience of our students. They're connecting it to the typeface of the Koran Sidurim that they're using, right? They're connecting it to your experience directly through architecture. And so when you walk in there, you feel like you are sort of in a place similar to where many of our students spent a year in Israel. It's that, and that's intentional, right? And it's meaningful to many of our students. And when the Israelis show up, they say, oh, yes, this looks like a yeshiva, because it looks like what they have, right? On the other hand, you see that in Israel, there are some interesting things going on. There are very modernist synagogues, and then there's the synagogues that are intentionally looking like the places that those folks came from, whether the Moroccans or the Indians. You can go from place to place. If you go to Akko, there's a synagogue covered with mosaics built by Tunisians. That's amazing, but it fits their historic aesthetic in a new Israeli way. And so, yes, it's changed everything as it's changed everything in general. And the architecture is one of the ways that we can see it and express it.
Well, one of the things that I've sort of noticed, just a little bit broadly outside of, is, American synagogues, I think and it's hard for me to say whether this is a function of Israel or a function of just the kind of suburbanization, the spread of a certain style of architecture in suburban settings. But at some point, and I got to think it was maybe after 67, right, it became much more au courant to use, Jerusalem stone, right? To have these evocations, not in Reform synagogues, in conservative synagogues. Here, it's fascinatingly, given all of the, division, right? There's a certain commonality. Now, again, I'm going to go with a sort of, I'm going to problematize, how much of that is Israel and how much of that is American suburbia. I don't know, but it's a mixture. It's definitely both.
Why would it be American suburbia?
I think these buildings reflect the functionality of, post-60s American kind of, it's not high modernism, but it's a kind of late, pre-postmodern. I don't know what you call it. It's before you get to Venturi. It's before you get to Geary, but it's that 60s and 70s kind of, I'll call it a strip mall aesthetic, for lack of a better term, but it's very suburban. Yes.
I once taught in a big Midwestern city, and every year I sent my students out to visit a synagogue. Now, my students were the United Nations, and I'd give them lessons. And this is what you do if you're going to an Orthodox synagogue. This is what you do if you're going to a Reform synagogue. Just how you behave in these places, right? How do you behave in a conservative synagogue? Well, and they'd have to write a reflection paper about what they did. Now, one day, one of the students came back with a reflection paper about this amazing thing of the Torah being carried through the synagogue and everyone kissing it and the level of piety. And I was convinced he'd gone to the Orthodox synagogue when he, in fact, had been in the most reformative synagogues in the city. That's one of the lessons that we see from this Jewish shared civil religion, which isn't always civil religion. Actually, sometimes it's regular old religion that Jews share And what these buildings sometimes let us do is get past the fact that the conservatives changed the Siddur this way and the Reform changed it this way and the Art Scroll people changed it that way, right? It lets us get past it to see the commonalities, which for have been underemphasized in recent historiography, and for me, both as a historian and as a human being, are really, really important.
You spoke before the interaction between the internal influence and the external influence. Here, what are the variations? It has to do with what you call with ideology. For example, take in Germany, which the Reform copying, they have to compete with the Protestant schools. In Italy, which you call the Italian architecture, how is it reflected in different ages, in different generations? Take, for example, the Reform, completely, to speak, the edifice complex. I want to make a statement. You didn't speak about East Europe. I see the synagogues in Eastern Europe, little churves, which are wooden stuff. I saw the shul from Chafetz Chaim. It's a nothing. You can see it inside, you don't see it. What is dominant? What influences what? Has to do with ages, location. How is it reflected in the building of the shul?
The answer is yes.
I'll just say, first of all, money. If you have money, you can do things. I think this rupture makes a big difference. So, there's in the old part of Mexico City, there is an incredibly beautiful synagogue that was a replica of a synagogue from Ukraine. Okay, and they did a beautiful, and it's been renovated. And if you go to Mexico City, you shouldn't miss it. It's a beautiful synagogue. And why? Because they finally had enough money. They were just about to leave the poor neighborhood, and they built it, right, at that point. And it was a way of evoking their past. So that rupture is so important, the money that they had, but and that they hope to have more and be able to kind of hold on to something. Yeah.
Well, just to kind of go to the Eastern Europe example, I think you're right to bring that up because that is kind of where you see this sort of, it's kind of where the rubber hits the road in a sense, right? You go to Warsaw, and the Wielki Synagogue in Warsaw is this kind of Baroque, I call it a kind of Baroque monstrosity. It was a big overbuilt, very heavily ornamented, right? Radin, of course, with the Chafetz Chaim, it's a small, it's like not a wealthy place, right? You go to Czernowitz. The main synagogue in Czernowitz was a big reform. It wasn't reform, but it was of the neo-Moorish style. But you go a few miles outside of that, and you're inside Agora, and there you have Hasidim built what I've described before, right? So it's fascinating. Eastern Europe is kind of one of the most fascinating in the sense that there was such a patchwork of kind of heterogeneous process. It's economic, it's cultural, and so you can be within, you can walk from 1 mile to the next and see a complete, or you go downtown in Krakow, right? You walk from the Ramah shul to the large, what was the kind of the mainstream community shul. One's a 19th century, very expensive, beautiful 19th century neo-Moorish, and then the Ramah shul is obviously, a late medieval, early modern construction. So
you should mention in Eastern Europe, when you speak about the big shuls, is what you call the city close, the Stutt-Klois. And then you have hundreds of Stieblach, which look like a borough park. No architecture, no aesthetics. Just convenience. You come, you dip your finger, you wash your hands, and that's it. So this is a big difference in Eastern Europe.
It's the same on the Lower East Side. Most people don't realize that the shul, what's the name of the? Eldred Street. The Eldred Street Synagogue would have been what you call the Stutt-Klois, right? And it's still, people think it's, this is old Ashkenaz, this is the old world. No, this was the fancy shul.
And you won't be surprised that in the world of the Talmud, there were the local synagogues that met in people's houses, and there was the house Beit Midrash where they would study, and then there were the big synagogues, and sometimes rabbis would show up in them, and sometimes they wouldn't. And it's a much more complex dynamic where monumental architecture, you're right, Shmuel, monumental architecture is one way of discussing it, but non-monumental architecture is sometimes even more interesting.
Okay, I'd like to thank our panelists, Jess Olson, Ronnie Perelis, and Steve Fine. Thank you very much for joining us today. And also many thanks to Itai Shelem, our producer, and to Yeshiva University for sponsoring this series. You too can support us by going to our website, that's tlv1.fm/Tel Aviv Review, and subscribing onto our Patreon campaign. Check out our archive, it has more than 500 interviews. And if you like what we do here, you can also like us on Facebook. Our page is called the Tel Aviv Review Podcast, Ideas from Israel. And please follow me and my co-host, Alex Shenlin, on Twitter. Join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review, and until then, goodbye.